Tony's Chocolonely is a real freak in the chocolate industry. I truly cannot think of any other brand in the world going to the same lengths as them to ensure they remain ethical. On the face of it, this is a mission-led company that rivals many charities in its verbal and financial support towards ending exploitation in the cocoa industry. I personally knew next to nothing about them apart from the fact that they are somehow an activist brand and that they unfortunately do not make orange chocolate, which happens to be my favorite type of chocolate. That is until this Christmas when I took a trip to Amsterdam and found myself walking around their superstore. There I came across lots of beautiful, colorful chocolate wrappers, a machine that can make your own customized chocolate, and this, a timeline talking about their history, which really piqued my interest. So when I saw it, I had to ask myself, what is the Harkin-Engel protocol? How does Tony's fit into that? And most importantly, are they really as ethical as they claim to be? So to understand who Tonys really are, we first need to understand what the Harkin-Engel protocol is and how it came to be. So in the early 2000s, reports came flooding into Western media of abhorrent abuses in the cocoa industry. Among them, the most striking was an investigatory documentary produced by documentarian Kate Blewett and producer Brian Woods, which spotlighted the extent of child slavery used in cocoa farms in West Africa, where most of the world's cocoa comes from. At the same time, multiple articles in the press gave the topic prominence, whilst the leaders of the affected countries accused Western companies and governments of complicity in the suffering of their people. For example, two Ivory Coast cabinet ministers flew to London in 2001 for talks with the then UK Foreign Office Minister for Africa, Brian Wilson, who gave promises to try to pressure big multinationals into changing their policies, arguably with little to no success. The thing is, farmers in West Africa were being paid $0.07 at the time. Can you imagine being paid $0.07 per day? What is that, like $2 in a month? Even now, they are being paid as little as 25 cents per day for their labor, when the absolute minimum living income is set at around $250 per day. Part of the problem is the fact that the chocolate industry is a monopsony, a term which refers to a market condition in which a single or limited amount of buyers have almost total control over the market and thus can dictate prices to sellers. Another part of the story that Western media often love to wash over is that the World Bank, who in their own website claim to be working to create a world free of poverty, forced poor countries in Western Africa, such as the Ivory Coast, to liberalize its cocoa industry in exchange for debt relief in 1999. This in turn scrapped the price guarantee for farmers, which ensured a minimum income and left them with diminishing returns, whilst chocolate prices in the Western world remained for the most part stable. And what happens when you force destitution level prices? Well, you force people to turn to cheaper and cheaper sources of labor, ultimately having to either employ children for literal pennies or to outright enslave them in the cocoa farms. Talk about a race to the bottom. Initially, the cocoa industry tried to deny that the reports about child slavery were real. Robert Zender, Secretary General of the European Cocoa Association, claimed, "I cannot deny that there are issues with child labor, but it is totally wrong to call it slavery." Spoiler alert, there was in fact slavery happening. So, amidst multiple reports of abuse, US Senator Eliot Engel of New York introduced legislation to create a fund that would facilitate the inclusion of a slave-free label for chocolate products sold in the US. This, of course, got the big companies into a panic, and so they deployed a bunch of lobbyists to try and kill a bill that would see them being legally accountable for their practices. In the end, the less radical US Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa became involved, and the bill was watered down to the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a non-legally binding agreement that the growing and processing of cocoa beans and the derivative products would be conducted in a manner that complies with the International Labour Organization's Convention 182 concerning the prohibition and immediate action for the elimination of the worst forms of child labour and adult forced labour on cocoa farms in West Africa. This was signed by the 8 largest US chocolate players, including Nestle and Hershey, as well as the US ambassador to the Ivory Coast. The industry groups World Cocoa Foundation and the Chocolate Manufacturers Association also became involved and committed to develop and implement voluntary standards to certify cocoa products without the worst forms of child labor by July 2005. This agreement was one of the first times an American industry was subjected to self-regulation and one of the first times self-regulation was used to address an international human rights issue. As you might have already guessed by the term self-regulation, the protocol's success was, well, horrible. The US Department of Labor contracted the University of Tulane to produce 4 reports on the progress made by industry towards the objectives set in the protocol, and by its 4th and final report, it concluded that the industry is still far from achieving its target. Big Choco missed every single deadline and objective, and although much of the world was not watching, a Dutch journalist of the name Teun van der Keuken was, with increasing frustration. In 2003, he co-produced a Dutch documentary on the topic as part of his show, and in 2005, when the chocolate industry missed another target, he decided to stage a publicity stunt by walking into an Amsterdam court and asking to be convicted for complicity in crimes against humanity for eating chocolate he knowingly knew was tainted with child slavery. He was not arrested or charged, however, and not much came of it apart from a few articles being written. And Keuken eventually understood that simply reporting on the topic was never going to move these huge players that are controlling the entire market and have no form of regulation to check their actions. So he decided to start his own chocolate company, which is how Tony's Chocolonely was born. Fun fact, Tony's is meant to be an anglicized version of his name, Teun, which he thought would feel more familiar to people in the Western world, whilst Chocolonely was meant to be a pun to highlight his sense of isolation in the chocolate industry in being the only person trying to act ethically. Since 2005, when the first 5,000 fair trade certified bars of Tony's chocolate entered the Dutch market, the company has had an impressive upwards trajectory, which has seen it combine aggressive marketing tactics with a clear sense of impact. Currently, Tony's hold 20% of the Benelux region's choco market, Benelux referring to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, but they also have a notable presence in the US and the UK, where they are currently the 4th largest chocolate brand. And Keuken's initial publicity stunt would become a signature move for the brand, which went on to create multiple provocative and thought-provoking marketing campaigns. In one instance, Tony's made a Sweet Solution campaign in which they copied the design of rivals like Kit Kat, Toblerone, and Twix to set a vision in which these companies could be replicating Tony's ethical principles. They also wrote an open letter addressed to Big Choco titled, "We copied you, now please copy us," explicitly calling on the Big Choco giants to embrace their humane practices. Needless to say that Big Choco was not amused, and they made that very clear. They quickly blackmailed supermarkets into rejecting Tony's campaign so that their initial partnership with retailers like Sainsbury's collapsed, and they ended up being able to sell their campaign-linked chocolate only through their own website. Another campaign in 2021 sought to highlight the inequalities that pervade the industry by using the company's advent calendar. Day 8 was deliberately left empty in order to symbolize the fact that some people, in this case the chocolate farmers, often receive nothing for their labor. Before you get angry, they were not just trying to rip off customers. They actually included 2 extra pieces of chocolate contained in the other spaces, so buyers were getting 25 chocolates for 24 days. This campaign received a rather mixed response, however, mainly because advent calendars are often gifts for children that do not have the awareness or intellectual maturity to understand this message. In turn, this made a lot of parents angry and arguing that the retailer could have chosen a different way to highlight the issue. I personally just loved the way right-wing media in the UK reported on this incident, The Sun and GB News more specifically calling Tony's message that child slavery is bad as being woke. I just felt that that message should not be controversial, but clearly The Sun and GB News disagree. Whether you agree or disagree with Tony's admittedly brash marketing stunts, the company is not just words and fancy campaigns. They have created a comprehensive business model to produce ethical chocolate, which they lay out in their 5 sourcing principles. The first one is traceable beans. Since 2013, Tony's has been able to trace 100% of their choco beans to ensure they have not been sourced with the input of child slavery. This level of traceability is essentially unprecedented, with the average among industry actors being as low as 40%. Tunis is able to do this firstly by partnering with trusted local cooperatives and by using a type of technology called the bean tracker. This is essentially a type of software that digitally logs the data collection from cooperative to chocolate production and includes a monitoring tool for all actors in the supply chain to see where the beans are at any particular moment in time. In the year 2022 to 2023, for example, they sourced 18,000 metric tons of traceable cocoa beans in this way. The second principle refers to paying a higher price to farmers. To achieve this, Tony's use the living income reference price. This is currently benchmarked at $2.49 per day per person by the Anchor methodology. The living income refers to the net annual income required for a household in a specific location to afford a decent standard of living for all its members. This includes covering essentials such as food, water, housing, education, healthcare, etc., etc. This is essentially the amount of money a household would need to live a dignified life. What's crazy is that to this day, no one in the big choco industry has committed to paying the living income price to farmers, apart from Tony's. And to achieve the living income reference price, Tony's take the initial price set for the cocoa, which is set by the government in which the cocoa is sourced, and they supplement it with the fair trade premium, which is the monetary premium paid for fair trade certified cocoa. This is, however, not enough for farmers to reach the living income reference price threshold, and so Tony's also pays the living income premium on top of that, which is meant to close the gap to the living income reference price. For example, in the Ivory Coast, this was set at $2,440 in the 2022-23 season. It is important to note that whilst the living income reference price suggests the amount needed to achieve a living income, there is often a gap between the price set and the actual price needed. As such, whilst Tony's premiums reduce this gap, they do not completely eliminate it. To date, only 21% of cocoa farming households Tony's partners with have closed this gap or exceeded it, so they clearly do have some way to go in being able to offer a true living income across their supply chain. The third principle refers to the long term. Tony's deliberately tries to foster long-term relationships with farmers in order to provide stability. To achieve this, they have set up memorandums of understanding with the local cooperatives to guarantee at least 5 years of collaboration. They also use direct and asymmetrical contracts, which allow the cooperatives to terminate the contract earlier and to trade with other partners they see fit, whilst Tony's has to honor the 5-year partnership in either case. So essentially, by committing to those long-term contracts, Tony's gives farmers a level of income security so that they can focus on planning beyond a single cocoa season. And it is fair to say that Tony's has relinquished not an insignificant amount of control here to the local cooperatives. They have essentially made the supply chain dependent on the farmers' input and willingness to keep partnering with them, giving those farmers an edge in any given negotiation round. The fourth principle refers to strong farmers. Part of creating strong farmers, of course, involves everything we discussed above. But a key part of it is also something called the child labor remediation system, which goes to the very heart of why Tony's was created in the first place. This was initially created by the International Labour Organization and adapted for application in the cocoa industry by the International Cocoa Initiative and Nestlé. The child labor remediation system worked by initially selecting self-motivated community facilitators who then conduct visits to the farmers' households to discuss what type of work children are allowed to do. A survey is also carried out and the findings are logged into the system. All cooperatives that Tony's work with are obliged to set up a social traceability system where those findings will be stored for transparency. Facilitators also undertake unannounced farm visits as an extra check. Roughly 95% of cases of child labor are identified through discussions with children and their parents rather than secret checks, though. So when child labor is identified, the community facilitator is meant to discuss the situation with the household and determine necessary remediation actions. For children, those are usually geared towards getting them back to school. And this might include arranging birth certificates for school enrollment, providing school kits, or organizing bicycles so kids can cycle to school. For households, the support usually involves equipping families with tools like wheelbarrows and belly pongos, which are safe tools used to open cocopods, so that older children can help around the farms without having to carry heavy loads or handle sharp tools. Since Tony started implementing this system in 2017, almost 19,000 households have participated, but it is important to note that it still does not cover all the cooperatives Tony's partners with, and there is significant variability in child labor rates between the cooperatives. Whilst in some the rate is as low as 5%, in others it is as high as 52%. The fifth and final of their sourcing principles refers to quality and productivity. Tony's achieves this by working with partner cooperatives to provide training and support in modern farming techniques. One standout method they use is called dynamic agroforestry, where different types of trees are grown alongside the cocoa plants. Take the planting of shade trees, for example. These trees are planted alongside cocoa plants to help maintain soil fertility by preventing erosion. They also buffer the cocoa plants from extreme weather, making the farms more resilient to climate change and keeping production levels relatively stable. Plus, shade trees can provide additional sources of income for farmers through the production of fruits and timber. This diversification in turn helps improve the economic stability of farming households. And Tony's goal is to eventually help farmers sustain 18 shade trees per hectare compared to the current standard of just 4 to 10. Okay, we have talked a lot about all the great things that Tony's does for the farmers and how much better they are than average industry. So, are Tony's just a perfect chocolate company, and have they succeeded where everyone else has failed? Well, no, not exactly. Whilst Tony's is technically 100% slave free, there are still instances of child labor occurring in their sourcing farms. For example, in the period 2022 to 2023, they found 1,072 cases of child labor in the supply chain, a massive rise compared to the 387 cases in the year prior. This puts their child labor rate at 10.5%. And part of this is simply that whilst Tony's pays a significantly higher price to farmers than wider industry, they are still in many cases not able to close the gap to a true living income for the farmers. And more recently, and to the shock of many, Tony's was removed from the ethical companies list curated by Slave Free Chocolate, a very well-established grassroots organization that campaigns to end child slavery in the choco industry. This was not because instances of modern slavery were discovered in their supply chain, but because of their association with Barry Callebaut, a Swiss chocolate manufacturer who has been accused of severe negligence and human rights abuses in several instances. For example, in 2021, they stood as a defendant alongside Mars, Nestlé, Hershey, and Mondelez in a US lawsuit filed on behalf of 8 former child slaves who claim they were forced to work unpaid on cocoa plantations in the Ivory Coast, with Barry Callebaut alongside the other players essentially aiding and abetting their enslavement. It is important to note that Tony's does not directly source cocoa beans from Barry Callebaut, but they do work with the company to process their cocoa beans. And this partnership has understandably led to concerns about Tony's commitment to ensuring a completely slave-free supply chain. Having said that, Tony's have worked with Barry Callebaut to establish a completely segregated processing ecosystem to ensure that beans which have not been sourced through their bean tracker system and which might be the result of child slavery are never present in their production lines. Tony's argue that this partnership is an effort to set up camp next to big players and help inspire change. Considering that they have been partnering with them since 2005, I am a bit skeptical of this vision, or rather their ability to deliver on it. Another more plausible argument is that of scalability. Tony's would not be able to process the amount of beans they are currently able to turn into chocolate bars without Barry Callebaut's processing powers. They also argue that showing that their brand is scalable is the only way to convince Big Choco that this is possible on a macro level, and that this partnership is essential to defeat the argument that such high ethical standards are only feasible on the scale of a few independent boutique brands. And I do believe that that is true, but we must also acknowledge the efficiency and potential advantage Tony's received through a partnership that has so far led to no real changes in practices among big chocolate players, at least that I could find. So, should you consume Tony's chocolate? Or are they just trying to brand wash you? This would be a very personal answer, depending on whether you believe you can change a system by standing completely outside of it. Play-free chocolate, for example, certainly believe that any engagement with actors that are not 100% ethical is enough to make one unethical. I personally think that despite Tony's partnership with Barry Callebaut, they're doing some truly amazing and revolutionary work in providing farmers with higher incomes, skills, and a voice in the supply chain in a way that is virtually unheard of in any company of their size. And I would rather that a company like Tony's receive an efficiency and scalability advantage rather than a company like Mondelez. I also think that these issues are not black and white. The chocolate industry is incredibly complicated, filled with vested interests and a multitude of stakeholders to balance. Engaging with companies that are not currently following ethical practices is, in my opinion, a good way to try and change their course. I'm personally still willing to give Tony's the benefit of the doubt in this partnership, but I would also certainly be looking to see them actually influence players like Barry Callebaut, whose practices don't seem to have improved since they started partnering with Tony's in 2005. But anyway, what do you think? Let me know in the comments. All my sources are linked below, and if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Stay critical.